There was a time when a nation could look at a war thousands of miles away and simply say that it is not our war. A country could close its borders, protect its commerce, and avoid military alliances in an attempt to remain outside the ambitions of competing empires. But what happens when the world becomes so interconnected that staying out of a war becomes almost as consequential as entering one? And what happens when neutrality itself begins to look less like independence and more like an obstacle to the geopolitical system surrounding you? Welcome back to the Unfiltered Political Lens. In our previous discussions, we've examined how the Spanish-American War and World War I helped transform the United States from a nation focused primarily on its own hemisphere into a major global power. But there is another side of that story that deserves our attention just as much. World War I didn't simply change America's relationship with the world. It helped change the world's relationship with neutrality. Before 1914, many of the Americans could still imagine a fundamental separation between European power struggles and the interests of the United States. When war erupted across Europe in 1914, President Woodrow Wilson had initially declared American neutrality and urged the Americans to remain impartial. The United States had stayed officially neutral for roughly 2.5 years, but maintaining that neutrality became increasingly difficult as the German submarine warfare, British blockades, attacks on shipping, and the growing economic connections pulled America deeper into the conflict. The sinking of the Lusitania in 1915, which killed more than 120 Americans, intensified the crises, and Germany's resumptions of uninstructed submarine warfare in 1917 had combined with the Zimmerman telegram that pushed the United States towards war on April 6, 1917. America had officially entered World War I against Germany. Think about what had happened. America had entered the 20th century still debating how deeply it should become involved in affairs of the world. Yet within a few years it was fighting a European war that had begun thousands of miles from American shores. World War I demonstrated something that would become increasingly important throughout the next century. Neutrality could exist on paper while becoming harder and harder to maintain in reality. A nation could refuse to choose a side that still has its ships attacked. It could attempt to avoid war and still be affected by the blockades and financial pressure, trade disruptions, and military developments. It could declare itself neutral while its economy and businesses, citizens, and political institutions had all become increasingly connected to one side of an international conflict. And that is a historical turning point I want you to remember in this part of the speech, because it sounds remarkably familiar to today. Neutrality did not simply disappear, it was squeezed by an increasingly interconnected world. World War I had showed how an alliances could transform a regional crisis into a continental catastrophe. It also showed how economic relationships could pull supposedly neutral nations into the gravitational field of war. And it showed how difficult it would be had it become for a country to remain completely detached once its security and prosperity had depended upon events beyond its borders. The Spanish-American War also had already pushed the United States toward a larger international role, but World War I had accelerated that transformation and helped to establish a neutral new reality. America could no longer assume that the world's conflicts would remain someone else's problem. Also, the old geographic protection was beginning to disappear as well. The Atlantic Ocean could no longer guarantee that the separation from international conflict, and more than a century later, the technology has particularly erased that distance altogether. Today, a conflict on the other side of the planet can affect financial markets within distance together. And again, let me repeat that. Today, a conflict on the other side of the planet can affect the financial markets within seconds, and a disruption in the Strait of Hormuz can also affect the energy prices around the world. A confrontation involving Taiwan can immediately become a question about Americans' military commitments, the Chinese economic power, semiconductor supplies, global shipping, and international trade. A war doesn't necessarily have to reach your neighborhood to reach your life, and that is a modern death of a distance, and perhaps the modern death of neutrality. For instance, let's consider Switzerland, a country whose neutrality has deep historical and legal roots. Switzerland has maintained a policy of permanent neutrality and has traditionally avoided the participation in armed conflicts and military alliances. But even Switzerland cannot simply disconnect itself from the global economy. It cannot completely escape international markets, financial systems, diplomatic pressures, or the economic consequences of wars happening elsewhere. And then consider Finland. For the decade, Finland maintained military non alignment, but Russia had full scale invasion of Ukraine, which fundamentally changed its security calculations. Finland applied to join NATO and formally became a member in April of 2023. Finland's decision was its own sovereign choice, but it illustrated something much larger. When the security environment changes, the neutrality itself can become a security question. And this is where World War I becomes so important to understand that the modern world. The First World War destroyed the illusion that the great power conflicts could always remain neatly contained. A crisis could spread through alliances, economic warfare, and it could affect neutral nations. Maritime warfare could threaten civilian commerce. Political decisions made in distant capitals could eventually force the countries that wanted no part of the conflict to reconsider their positions. The lessons was not necessarily that neutrality was impossible, but the neutrality had become much more difficult in an interconnected world. Also today, that problem become even more complicated because warfare no longer requires armies crossing borders. The nations can be pressured through sanctions, banking restrictions, energy supplies, cyber attacks, trade restrictions, intelligence operations, military alliances, and information campaigns. Now, this battlefield can be a physical, economic, digital, financial, or psychological. The modern battlefield is bigger than war itself. A country can attempt to remain outside of a military conflict while still being affected by its economic consequences and its energy consequences, its refugee crisis, its cyber warfare, or its geopolitical fallout. And that environment neutrality becomes increasingly difficult to define. And what brings us to the uncomfortable question: what happens when virtually every major international crisis becomes connected to a larger global struggle? Russia and Ukraine, Israel, Iran, and the Strait of Hormuz, Taiwan, the South China Sea, cyber warfare, artificial intelligence, energy security, the global financial system. Each issue has its own history and its own complexities, but the governments and political movements increasingly connect them to a broader competition between the major powers. Once everything becomes connected, there is less room for countries that simply want to stand outside the conflict. And there is nowhere left to stand when every crisis is presented as a test of allegiance. And this brings us to the deeper meaning of the death of neutrality. Because this isn't just about the governments. It can eventually affect ordinary citizens as well as if every international issue becomes a test of its loyalty, then the disagreement can become suspicious. If every conflict is presented as a struggle between absolute good and absolute evil, then asking questions can be portrayed as helping the enemy. If every foreign policy decision is described as an existential emergency, then the diplomacy can begin to look like weakness, compromise can look like surrender, and skepticism can be treated as disloyalty. And we should also be careful here, because recognizing propaganda, questioning official narratives, and examining the government's decisions are legitimate parts of a free society. But that doesn't mean every major crisis is secretly planned or controlled by the hidden group. History gives us plenty of documented examples of governments using the propaganda, censorship, persuasion, and information campaigns during wartime without requiring us to believe that every event is part of one master plan. The more important question is actually much simpler. Who benefits when the public believes there are only two possible choices? Because because you accept that there are only two sides, neutrality becomes betrayal, and questioning the war becomes weakness. Negotiation becomes apparent or appeasement, and the skepticism becomes disloyalty. That is why World War I should be remembered as more than simply a war that had killed millions and destroyed empires, redrew borders, and transformed American foreign policy. It was also one of history's great demonstrations of how interdependence can destroy the isolation. America attempted to remain neutral for years, but the pressures created by submarine warfare, attacks on American shipping, economic interests, in the broader international crisis eventually had overwhelmed the position, and more than a century later, the basic problems remains. Can a nation truly remain neutral when its economy depends upon the global trade? Can it remain neutral when its banks, technology, energy communications, and supply chains are connected to the rest of the world? Can it remain neutral when military alliances define the security architecture around it? And perhaps most importantly, can individual citizens remain intellectually independent when every side is demanding their allegiance? Maybe the neutrality isn't completely dead. Maybe that has died as what the assumption is, that the neutrality can be passive. Perhaps the modern neutrality requires something much harder, like the ability to maintain independence while still engaging with the world, to condemn aggression without automatically endorsing every action taken by the opposing side. Now, to support diplomacy without becoming an apologist, to criticize your own government without becoming an enemy, or your country to criticize other governments without believing that its entire population is your enemy. Because if World War I taught us anything, it is that the conflicts rarely remain where they began. And a crisis is that one country can become a crisis for another. An economic dispute can become a military confrontation. A regional alliance can become a global commitment. And a nation that believes it can simply stand outside of history may eventually discover that history has already entered through the door. So perhaps the death of neutrality isn't simply the disappearance of countries that call themselves neutral. Perhaps it is the disappearance of the belief that any country or any individual can completely escape the consequences of a world increasingly organized around the competing powers. The real challenge for the 21st century may therefore be preserving something even more important than neutrality: independent thought. Because when governments, media organizations, political movements, and social networks all compete to tell us which side we are supposed to choose, perhaps the most powerful thing an individual can still say is, I want to understand the fact before I choose. And that leaves us with a final question. If nations can no longer afford to remain neutral, can their citizens still afford thinking independently? Now, maybe that is the question World War I left behind for every generation that followed. And maybe it is the question our generation has to answer now. This is the Unfiltered Political Lens. And if you found this analysis informative, please make sure to like, share, and subscribe because understanding history isn't about choosing a side before you know the facts. It's about asking the questions that remain after everyone else tells you the answer. And yes, as always, we'll see you in the next episode. Thanks for watching. Peace. We'll see you in the next one.